going on, everybody? Here we are on a Monday. I hope you had a great weekend. I certainly did. On Saturday, my dad and I went up to a card show about 45 minutes from here. Super fun show. Didn't buy a lot. Saw a lot of familiar faces. That's always a lot of fun for me. And, you know, I think I spent $40. I'll show you what I bought in the next few days. I'm not going to do a full video of the show, but I will show you a couple of my pickups. My dad, he bought a couple of things as well, but nothing spectacular. Then yesterday on Sunday, we've had a big storm coming through California over the last few days, supposed to go a few more days. Well, Lucy's team still had a game, so it's always fun to see her out there battling. The high school season's over. She's now into club, so she's back with her club team again, so super fun checking that out. Now, last week, the question was, what era, if we were to look forward like 20 years, what era of cards do we think are going to increase in value the most? And I broke it down into 4 main categories. Those categories were the modern stars, like the Trouts and Ohtanis, okay? Or like the 90s, 80s, late 80s, early 90s stars, like the Jeters and Ken Griffey Juniors. Or would we say the golden era of baseball, which are like the 50s and 60s, or the pre-war stuff, you know, the Lou Gehrig's, the Babe Ruths. So that was my question for you. And some of your responses were outstanding. Now, my favorite, to be honest, I'll be totally honest, the thing I sometimes like the most is when you guys just completely disagree with me. I love hearing the variety of opinions. So we're going to get into you guys and what your response is. You know, we think because a lot of the people who watch this channel, they're vintage collectors. You'd think, oh, everybody's going to say old school, pre-war, and golden era. That's not necessarily the case. You all had some really, really interesting takes. We'll take a look at those comments here in just a second. But first, a couple people sent me some really cool stuff. My guy, Brian sent me this awesome pirate card from 1933, Worldwide Gum. Really cool card. Really enjoyed getting that one. So thank you so much for that, Brian. And then Warren, when I was at that card show on Saturday, my guy Warren came up to me. I've met Warren several times. He's such a nice guy. He's like, hey, Greg, I was hoping you'd be here. I got some Greg Nettles cards for you. So he gave me some cool Greg Nettles cards. I'm always looking to pick up some of those. Now, this card, I don't think I had. A lot of these, whenever I have, when you're a big-time collector of a player, you have a lot of the cards. It's always fun to get more. But that one, I don't think I had before. This has always been one of my favorite poses. I love how his batting gloves there. He's got the top glove, but not the bottom glove. I always thought that was interesting. And then a cool Clemens card as well. So Warren, thank you so much. My buddy Darren from Return to Collecting, he said, hey, Greg, he got the 38 heads up Gaudy. Very cool. And then he's got his information and QR code on the back. Numbered at 3 out of 5. So this is an out of 5. That's got to make the value just skyrocket. So thank you, my guy Darren. Again, you know Darren from Return to Collecting. We do a video together about once a month. So stay tuned in the not too distant future. We'll be doing another discussion this month. And then I got a cool stack of cards from Chris. He gave me this cool Clemens card. That's awesome. And then a bunch of these Star cards. We know of Star from, you know, the basketball sets. But he gave me a few of those, a fairly decent stack of them. And then also a Matt Manning relic card. This is cool. Little relic on there of my guy, Matt Manning, who pitched really well in his first outing of spring training. So I think he had like 3 strikeouts in 2 innings. Maybe gave up 1 hit. It's either 1 hit or 1 walk. I can't remember. And then this awesome kind of mosaic or prism or whatever it is. Awesome card. So thank you for those, Chris. So let's go ahead and take a look at your guys' thoughts on that question about what era do we expect to go up the most over the next 20 years? Let's take a look.
For myself, I like vintage because it's the golden era of baseball. Really enjoyed as a kid reading about some of the greats like Mantle, Aaron, Clemente, Mays, Jackie, among others. I think pre-war is, however, the blue chip stock. I think golden era is a good gateway for people that are just getting into vintage, which then potentially lead to pre-war. I would say, though, that people should do what they feel is best for themselves and situations. I would also say the biggest mistake isn't just spending money on vintage or ultra modern, but spending more than one can afford to lose, which may be simple advice and yet easy to get carried away too.
Now, this is a great question, and I had another comment that had a lot of overlap and similarities as far as the final kind of conclusion of their thoughts. So I want to take a look at these two together. So let's take a look at the second comment that mentioned some of these same thoughts, and then I'll kind of give you my perspective on it. Let's check it out.
For baseball cards, the 80s and 90s guys are crippled by the junk wax era and the production levels followed by the stain of the post-strike steroid era, golden insert age of the mid-90s. My most upside answer is actually 90s basketball because those cards were by far the most popular at the time, MJ's peak influence, post-strike disinterest for baseball. And they were game-changing cards of which their influence ring loud and clear in the hobby almost 30 years later today. The 90s basketball inserts marked the focal shift from base cards, which existed since basically the 50s on, to shiny new and innovative designs with scarcity embedded within the releases. And which now includes the coming of age for those of us in the late 30s and 40s who were 8 to 13 in that era. And with that, we generally also bring growing disposable income and age-related nostalgia, which I suspect also leads to a natural increase in demand over that 25-year period as we age through our 40s, 50s, and into our 60s. Since this is a baseball channel question, the answer is this case is probably pre-war. Golden Age 50s tops are the gateway drug for vintage curious collectors. And that movement has largely already happened for a lot of the post-pandemic collection influx of the last 4 years. Pre-war and oddball issues are the next thing that usually follows once people get saturated and bored by those classic 50s widely available Topps and Bowman issues. And pre-war oddball have the lower pop, which generally makes it easier for demand increases to multiply the price increases.
So both of these mentioned something that I thought was extremely interesting to consider, and that's that the golden era, right, the 50s and then some of the 60s, is kind of like the gateway for vintage. Like, some of us think, oh, well, late 60s, early 70s, we might consider vintage, which is a whole nother discussion. But what we largely think of when we think of vintage stars, we think of Mantle and Mays and Aaron and Clemente and Koufax and, Bob Gibson, these guys that their cards are really spanning from the 50s and 60s. And they both mentioned that's kind of the gateway to vintage. And I think that is totally fair when you go to a card show, right? If you go to a card show and you just scan the vintage dealers, the overwhelming majority of most vintage dealers are cards from the 50s and 60s. They are the most plentiful. They are the names that people are most familiar with. So it does seem like, Hank Aaron, Mickey Mantle, Ernie Banks. Those are the guys that a lot of us have heard and are most drawn to. So what happens is a lot of people that decide to go that route start to get into those types of players. Now, why are those players the ones that we kind of know about? Now, I don't know. I don't think any of us know. But if you think pre-World War II, a lot of that baseball was radio based, right? It was, there's not a lot of video footage of those guys. There's how much video footage is there of Lou Gehrig playing baseball, right? Not a lot. Not a lot of Ty Cobb video footage playing baseball. There's a little bit, but not much. But then you think of guys like Mickey Mantle and Hank Aaron and Willie Mays, and there's tons and tons and tons of footage. So because there's tons of footage of those guys, I think that they're the guys that we're kind of most familiar with. Also, those of us that are in my age group, right, born in the 70s, which is a lot of us, we all have parents that are baby boomers, right? The baby boomers really being, late 40s, early 50s when they were born. Well, we learned about baseball from our parents, a lot of us, not everybody, but a lot of us did. And so because a lot of us have the stories from our parents, we, when you get into vintage, you think of the players that our parents knew and loved, like Willie Mays, like Mickey Mantle. So it's not that unreasonable to say, oh, we've heard the stories about these guys. We have the video footage of these guys. And those are the guys that are most plentiful at the card shows when I go and I look at vintage cards. So yeah, that's kind of the first place that a lot of vintage collectors would start. So the question then becomes, is that where we start and finish, or is that just where we start? Now, pretty much every collector that I know of that went into vintage, they started kind of narrow. Like, I was just talking to Sammy Thunder on a video that I posted yesterday. If you haven't checked that out, check that out. I was talking to Dom from Staven Sports Cards and Sammy Thunder. And what Sammy said was, yeah, when I started getting back into vintage, I decided to do the 1965 set. And then he started the 1965 set, and then it expanded from there. And I think that's what a lot of us do, is we start somewhere and then we expand. We get to the point where we're kind of done with that, or we kind of get bored of it. Now, my friend Theo from Clemente Collector. Theo did, he's a Clemente collector. Obviously, it's the name of his channel. But then he has recently, even over the weekend, posted some videos about how he's kind of expanding from just Clemente, that he's also doing some Stan Musial. And he's talked about why. I think he mentioned a while back that I think it was his father-in-law is a Stan Musial fan. So he's into Stan Musial. So what happens is we all have a starting point, and then we tend to kind of spread, and whether it's a year, whether it's a set, whether it's a player. And so I think it's very normal that we want to expand. My dad, I've talked about, collected the 1959 and 60 set. Well, he started with just the Yankees 1960s team set. And then he got them all, and he's like, I don't want this to be over. I want to keep going. So then he went to the full 60 set. Once he finished the whole 60 set, he's like, well, I don't want to be done. I want to keep going. So then he went to the 59 set. So I think it's very normal for us to want to branch out. And when you go to lots of shows and you scan a lot of stuff on auctions online, I think it's very natural to, once you see the same things over and over and over, then you start to see something else. It's kind of exciting to see that new thing. And that new thing kind of draws us in. And so I do think the 50s and the 60s is the place that a lot of vintage collectors start, but then where do they go? And where a lot of them go, they tend to gravitate toward things that they maybe haven't seen a lot. And if you haven't seen it a lot, it's usually because it's rare. So is it those kind of specialty regional cards, some people call them oddball cards, or is it to go older to the stuff that's just not as plentiful? So both of these two comments talk about, yeah, people tend to start in the 50s and 60s, but I think a lot of people tend to branch out. And what we tend to do is go older and rarer, not just, oh, I'm done collecting cards from the 50s and 60s, so now I'm going to go to the 70s. I think this is a really interesting point. So a lot of us that are collecting in that golden era, I think the next natural thing might be, like these two mentioned, going older and going pre-war. And if that's the case, if that's where a lot of people are headed and the demand goes up a little, I certainly think it's reasonable to think that that might be where a surge would be coming from next.
Vintage and pre-war will always demand the highest prices. However, I think Hall of Fame hitters from the 80s and 90s that had rookies in the 70s and early 80s have the most potential upside. Guys like Brett, Henderson, Gwynn, Yount, Boggs, and Sandberg all have fairly affordable rookie cards with a lot of potential for growth over the long term. I think cards 1985 and newer are overproduced and have too many high-graded cards available to have any substantial gains over time. Modern cards are just too expensive to be worthwhile as an investment for anything other than quick flips.
I really like this comment. It is true that a ton of us started collecting in the 80s, and we grew up in the 80s. We're the kids of the baby boomers. So, a lot of the vintage collectors are baby boomers that are, getting up there in age. And then it's the kids of baby boomers who are the ones who heard about them, as I was just talking about a second ago. And for me, when I think about, being the kid of a baby boomer, I grew up watching baseball primarily in the 80s. Now, watching it in the 80s, watching guys like Brett and Boggs and Gwynn and Yount and Winfield and all of those players that were great in the 80s, it is true that there is nostalgia in this hobby. I mentioned at the top of the video that I went to a card show this weekend, and I went through a couple of dollar boxes. Well, I went through several dollar boxes because it's just fun. And as I'm going through these dollar boxes, I was pulling out cards of guys that I watched growing up. I pulled out some Rickey Henderson cards, early 80s. I pulled out some early 80s Nolan Ryan cards. I pulled out an 86 Topps traded Jose Canseco, an 87 Donruss rated rookie Mark McGwire. And it's like, why would I want those cards? Well, what is the reason I want those cards? Well, I wanted those cards because those cards were unaffordable when I was a kid. And those guys were absolutely front and center. Late 80s, 88, 89, it was all about the A's. Those teams were loaded. And McGwire and Canseco were the heart of that lineup. And so when you think about that, and part of this hobby is the nostalgia and reliving your childhood and remembering cards from your childhood. And I'm going through a dollar box and I'm like, man, I remember in 1989 when this McGwire card was $20 then, and now it's in a dollar box. 30 years later, it's in a dollar box, and I've never had it. I've never had the Mark McGwire rated rookie card. Yeah, I'm going to buy that for $1. So nostalgia is certainly real. I was talking to my dad about this on the drive to and from the card show, and he's like, yeah, the reason he collected the 59 and 60 sets is because he was 9 and 10 years old at the time, and those are the packs that he opened. He's like, I totally understand why you'd want an 87 Donruss rated rookie Mark McGwire card, because it's your childhood card. Because it's the same reason I wanted a 1960 Mickey Mantle and a 1960 Ernie Banks, is because it's my childhood. So totally agree that as a lot of us midlifers have gotten back into collecting and gotten back into the hobby, and the nostalgia is real from our childhood, it certainly is reasonable to think that the Gwynns and the McGwires and the Boggses and the Bretts and the Younts and the Ozzie Smiths and all of those types of guys would be cards that a lot of us would want to put in our collection. And if the demand goes up, it certainly seems reasonable to think that the prices would go up. I mean, I remember a couple of years ago looking at an 84 Donruss Don Mattingly and I don't need it to be a 10. I was looking at an 8 and it was selling for about $50. I just looked at one the other day at an auction, it sold for 75. That means that card is up 50% over the last couple of years. 50% in the down card market. An 84 Donruss Don Mattingly is up 50%. I think that's the type of card that this comment is mentioning. Now, it doesn't seem like a lot because it's just up $25. But percentage-wise, it's 50%. Does that mean I'm going to go out with all my money and buy up a bunch of early 80s rookie cards and late 70s rookie cards? No, I'm not suggesting that. I'm just saying that what this comment has to say, I think has some validity, and it is certainly reasonable to think that that might be where price increases are coming. Now, what the rest of us choose to do with that is up to us, but it's possible that this could be an increase. The big concern is the supply. There's so much of it out there. There are so many Kirby Puckett rookie cards out there. Will it ever be worth a fortune? Probably not. But that Don Mattingly's up quite a bit. So, but only time will tell.
Well, I know I have been saying this for 2 years now, but nothing has changed my opinion. My crystal ball tells me any vintage card with good centering and great clarity will outperform high-graded vintage. I think high-grade vintage will continue to decline in value on an overall percentage based when people realize more and more the rarity is in the centering, not the grade. To add, I would stick to only buying the greats, Mantle, Jackie, Aaron, the usual suspects as far as vintage goes. I also think the future is bright for modern cards that have a very hard pack-pull ratio to them, and I also think the high-grade 10s in modern will come down in value as people realize a card numbered, say, out of 50 in a PSA 8 looks exactly like a 10 and is just as rare. I would stick with the guys like Pujols, Trout, Ichiro, Mookie. Plenty of guys to choose from who are on track to be the greatest players ever and locks for the Hall of Fame. As for pre-war, nothing new here. It will continue to rise slowly and is a very safe bet, but I think sticking with tops is the best bang for your buck, considering that has the most eyeballs and collectors. Those are my thoughts and how I have been going for about 2 years now and will continue to collect this way regardless if I am proven wrong in the coming years or proven correct. I have a 10-year window on my thinking, and for the modern guys like Trout, I have 15 to 20-year window.
So my guy Dylan continues to beat the drum about centering, and it's hard to argue with him. It's hard to argue with him that centering is the way to go. Now, there are a lot of collectors that say, what are you talking about? We've always known centering is important. And I don't think Dylan's acting like understanding that centering is suddenly important. I don't think he's suggesting that. The reason he continues to talk about centering being important is because people continue to mention rarity, right? Cards that are rare are always going to be sought after. And if you think about rare, one of the rarest things out there are centered vintage cards. Now, not just centered vintage cards, but centered vintage cards with a sharp appearance. We have to remember the paper quality back then was awful. The technology that cut the cards was awful. Quite frankly, quality control when it comes to vintage cards was horrible. It was absolutely horrible. It's not like now where you open a pack of Prism and 9 out of 10 cards could get a 10 grade. It wasn't like that then. A lot of the cards were cut at an angle, were cut off center, had print lines, had print marks, had ink marks, had roller marks. There were tons and tons of issues, and the paper itself was not nearly like the cardstock that's used now. So I also like the fact that Dylan said, Greg, why are you focusing on an era? It's not about the era, it's about the quality. And the question isn't really which era is going to go up the most. It's something different than what you gave us as the options. I like it when you guys don't just answer the question on face value, but you actually go to like the next level and say, no. You're not focusing on the right thing. The thing to actually talk about right here is centering, because that's what's actually rare. It does seem like in an era where cards have gotten really, really expensive, that if you're going to buy an affordable copy of some card, it doesn't even matter what the card is. Let's say a 55 Roberto Clemente rookie. If you're going to buy one of those, which in a 1 is like $1,000. So most of us aren't going to go out and buy an 8, right? That is completely unaffordable. So you're like, okay, I want a card of this. I want this Roberto Clemente rookie card. I can't afford an 8. I'm going to save up to get a 1 or a 2 or a 3. And it's definitely going to have corner issues, and it's probably going to have a crease. I at least want it to be nice to look at. I at least want it to be pleasant to look at. And a card that's 95-5 centering, for a lot of people, isn't pleasant to look at. A card with a crease going through his face isn't that pleasant to look at. A card with a big stain across his jersey isn't pleasant to look at. But a centered card is usually fairly pleasant to look at. So if we're looking at rare cards and we're talking about vintage, centering, it is very, very difficult to find a centered copy of a card with vintage. Like, we're talking really, really well centered. So I think that, it's really difficult to argue with Dylan's take that a lot of these cards in lower grades, but are really well centered and have really good eye appeal, that's really the future. Not the card that's 80-20 centered with sharper corners. It's about the centered one, because a lot of us want to own these cards, but we can't break the bank on the uncirculated sharp corners, so I at least want it centered. It seems like it's very reasonable to think that the growing demand is going to continue to be towards the nice looking centered ones instead of the sharper off-centered ones. Dylan will continue to tell us about this, and I don't blame him, because he's all in. He is all in on centered cards.
If I had a crystal ball, I'd say the 90s era cards. Though it surprises me to say that, I feel that they are the most undervalued. Pre-war and golden era are pretty solid already. Modern stars, to me, due to the fake supply of them, are already overvalued. That leaves the 90s for the most upside. The caveat, I think, is taking the highest percentage increase in value, not total increase in value. I mean, if a 52 tops mantle in a PSA 10 goes up 10%, that would be more than the value of a Trout Bowman Chrome Draft Superfractor 1 of 1.
So Darren, that surprised me to hear Darren say this. I mean, Darren has an incredible collection, right? If you're a subscriber of Darren's channel, you've seen some of his amazing cards. He just recently bought a beautiful Joe DiMaggio play ball. And, he does his top 50 countdown, and he shows us parts of his amazing collection. But here he is saying, well, Greg, I actually think the 90s have the most upside. And he's saying the pre-war cards are already fairly expensive. And the golden era cards are already pretty expensive. So for those to go up a lot of dollars, right? For those to increase a fair amount of dollars sure, they'll go up a fair amount of dollars, but percentage wise, $1,000 card would have to go up $100 to go up 10%. But if we're looking at a card from, the 90s, like a Griffey insert that might be $100, it's not unreasonable that card could jump to $120, which would be a 20% jump. So as a percentage jump, he's saying that the 90s, because they're not that expensive yet, like a lot of the pre-war cards and the golden era cards, the 90 cards don't have to jump as much in dollar amounts to jump a lot percentage-wise. I mean, I could see it. The Griffeys, the Jeters, some of those guys, they're legendary guys. They're all-time great guys, very likable guys, but a lot of their stuff is still fairly affordable. Now he mentions that the ultra modern, he's like, oh, this, is out of 50, out of 25. It's hard to even know what to make of some of that. But the 90s and some of those inserts in the 90s, those cards are still fairly affordable, especially in baseball. Some of the basketball ones have jumped a lot. But the football and the baseball do still seem affordable. And if they're affordable, it doesn't take a big jump in dollar amount to be a big jump in percentage amount. That's interesting. I mean, it's a great point. I don't disagree with it, but it's incredible to hear that from a guy like Darren, who's got a ton of pre-war stuff and a ton of 50 stuff. And he even said it himself. He said, I'm surprised to hear myself say this. But, a lot of us that grew up with Jeter probably want to have a couple of cool Jeter cards. And you say, I don't like Jeter. Okay. Griffey or whoever. Insert the name of whatever player from that decade that you did like. A lot of people want those cards, and it'll be interesting because the supply is the part that's keeping that honest right now. The thing that's keeping those cards from really going up a lot is the supply. So is the supply being large enough to offset the nostalgia for those of us that are in our midlife, card collecting era?
In answer to the crystal ball question, I say none of the above. Greg, where's the love for the 1970s? The Big Red Machine, A's and Yankees dynasties, so many 70s Hall of Famers and their rookie cards, our fellow Mustang Ozzie Smith included. There were records broken and Seth Ruth's home run smashed, Aaron, stolen base record, Brock, Ty Cobb's record, Rose, all mid-70s. Do you want to talk about value? Look no further than 70s. Graded cards for under $30, yeah, can't beat that. And the era has some amazing visual shots too. My favorite, Johnny Bench, 1976, standing like a badass at home plate in a cloud of dust, or many other cards of Jim Palmer in full windup about to deliver a fastball. Not to mention the greats, Aaron and Mays, from the 1950s and 60s, retired in the 70s, their last card, people. So why is this era so overlooked in terms of sports card collectibles? It's been nearly 50 years since the young... It's nearing on 50 years since the Yount and Brett rookie cards, and we're still talking about as if those two rookie cards define the 70s. I have two words, Mike Schmidt. Lastly, having been a collector since the late 80s, I recall folks clamoring for vintage 50 stars in the late 80s. At that time, the 50s cards were just 30 years old. So, how is it that the 70s cards, I include the NFL too, are just not vintage enough for today's collectors?
So many great things in this comment. You know, first thing I love is you're like, Greg, it's none of the above. It's the section you left out. It's not pre-war. It's not 50s, 60s. It's not 80s, 90s. It's not modern. It's the one section you left out. That's actually the best section. Again, I love it when you guys think outside the box with your responses and say something. Greg, it's none of the above. It's the one group you left out. And then he says, look at all of the amazing things that happened in the 70s, right? The hits record goes down. And again, it's not even when does it go down, but when is the bulk of these players' cards? But some major things happened during this era. You had some big stars like Aaron and Mays that, ended their careers. So their last cards, the cards with all their stats on it. You've got, Aaron breaks Ruth's record. There are records from, Pete Rose played for so long. He's got cards all the way from the early 60s all the way to the late 80s, right? But when you look at a guy like Pete Rose, the heart of his career is there in the 70s. And I mean, these are excellent points that there's a lot that happened then. And he's right. When I was a kid, my dad was collecting 59 and 60, as I've mentioned many times. And it was like, whoa, those cards are old. This is in 1987, 88, 89. I'm like, those cards are old. But they were 30 years old. They were 30 years old, right? A 1960 card in 1990 is 30 years old. But they seemed old. Well, now, like he mentions, the Brett and Yount rookie from 75, those cards are almost 50 years old. Those cards are way older than the cards that my dad was putting his set together from 1960 during 1990. So sometimes I think we lose track of what is actually old. What is old? So if a card is 50 years old, can we agree that that's fairly old? Now, some people would say, well, the production is more in the 70s. That's true. There was more production in the 70s than there were in the 50s. The other part of it is they started really coming out with card protection in the 50s. People started to take, cards and put them into photograph sleeves to protect them because people started finally realizing, cards might have value. So in the 70s, it wasn't just, okay, those cards were old. The difference, I think, might be that in the 50s, cards were going in bike spokes, right? And cards were just being tossed around and played with, and you hear kids about playing games and shooting marbles at their cards and stuff. That was starting to slow down in the 70s because people were starting to say, oh, these things might actually be valuable. Some of the big card page sleeve manufacturing was firing up in the 70s. So I think that maybe part of the reason that the 70s, even though they're 50 years old, aren't considered old and vintage like some of those other cards is it's because it's really about the mindset change. When did people start to say, this might be valuable, therefore I need to take care of it? I mean, we see guys on, Whatnot now doing breaks for cards, doing them in gloves, and they're wearing gloves. The card immediately comes out of the pack, immediately goes into a sleeve, into a top loader, and it only touches air for like 20 seconds. Compare that to what they were doing to cards in the 50s. See, that in itself is part of the reason why cards from the 50s will be valuable and the modern cards is to be determined, because these cards now are treated like they immediately are created to be valuable versus these other cards back in pre-war and the golden era where it's like, well, they were made to be fun and played with, and oh wow, they ended up being valuable. Completely different. So there's a lot of great stuff in this comment, and I totally get where you're coming from. And yeah, I didn't include it, and I could have included it in a section, but I didn't. But there's fair points in it for sure. You know, the other part that I mentioned a second ago, as I looked down at the question that I printed out, is, you know, the last cards. You know, and there is something cool about looking at a card with all the stats on it, you know, and when you look into the, you know, early 70s, when the guys like a Willie Mays are starting to retire and their cards have all of those stats, and then the late 70s when a guy like Hank Aaron is starting to retire. I mean, remember on the backs of those cards where it's like they played so many years and there's so many lines, the font is like absolutely tiny to fit all of their years and all of their stats on it. There is something very cool about that. And there are a lot of people who like collecting the last card of different players. I understand why someone might think that the 70s is the way to go too. Again, there is no right or wrong answer. We won't know for 20 years to know what will be great in 20 years. But I think that the variety of responses from all of you, which they're well thought out responses, shows exactly that. We don't know. It could be anything. So we're just making our own educated guesses. So I want a similar question for this week. So my question for this week is, looking forward 20 years, I have two questions, two parts to the question, I should say. What are two cards that you think will go up? Two specific cards, not players, not years, not sets, not eras, but give me two specific cards that you think will go up and increase in value the most over the next 20 years. So an example, you might say the 1956 Roberto Clemente Topps card and the 1959 Bob Gibson Topps card. Those are the two I think are going to go up the most. Now, are those the two? No, not necessarily. I'm just giving you, I want you to give me two specific cards. And then I want you to give me two specific cards that you think will go down the most and decrease in value the most. Now, a decrease might look like, well, it won't go down the most, but it just won't increase as much. So maybe you think this card, that for your decrease cards, will be flat over the next 20 years. Similar to my 87 Donruss Mark McGwire that I picked up over the weekend. That actually has gone a little bit down, but what do you think will either go down or not increase? What is going to be stagnant? What is not going to rise while everything else is rising over the long term? So, two cards you think will increase the most over the next 20 years, and two cards that you think will either decrease over the next 20 years or not go up with the rest of them. Again, I think that I'm leaning towards starting a new video series with this kind of concept about throwing out different cards and what do we think is going to happen. And based on your feedback and your responses this week is going to kind of determine whether or not I start this new kind of series with this topic of if we had a time machine, if we had a crystal ball, but this time instead of an era, I want a specific card or two that you think will go up and won't. I'm really interested to hear your take on these topics, on this specific question, on what's going to go up and what isn't. Can't wait to hear what you have to say.